Today, we will be voting on 3 joint resolutions of disapproval, or JRDs, to block the sale of certain offensive weapons to Israel. These resolutions are SJ Res 111, to block the sale of 120-millimeter tank rounds, SJ Res 113, to block the sale of 120-millimeter high-explosive mortar rounds, and SJ 115, to block the sale of JDMs, the guidance kits attached to many of the bombs dropped in Gaza. Madam President, I would note to my colleagues that these resolutions are strongly supported by more than 100 civil society groups, including pro-Israel groups like J Street, some of the largest labor unions in this country, including the SEIU, the United Auto Workers, and the United Electrical Workers, humanitarian groups like Amnesty International and Doctors of the World, and religious groups like the United Methodist Church, the Friends Committee, and many, many other organizations. And Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the list of these supporting organizations.
Without objection.
Madam President, I would also point out that poll after poll shows that a strong majority of the American people oppose sending more weapons and military aid to fund Netanyahu's war machine. And I would also mention, interestingly enough, that according to a poll commissioned by J Street, this is a pro-Israel organization, 62% of Jewish Americans support withholding weapons shipments to Israel until Netanyahu agrees to an immediate ceasefire. Madam President, these resolutions are aimed at offensive weapons that have been used to devastating effect against civilians in Gaza and Lebanon. They would not affect any of the systems Israel uses to defend itself from incoming attacks. Madam President, from a legal perspective, these resolutions are simple, straightforward, and not complicated. Bottom line, the United States government must obey the law. Not a very radical idea. But unfortunately, that is not the case now. And every member of the Senate who believes in the rule of law, that our government should obey the law, should vote for these resolutions. The Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act are very clear. The United States cannot provide weapons to countries that violate internationally recognized human rights or block U.S. humanitarian aid. Let me repeat that, because that is the essence of this entire debate, not complicated. The United States government cannot provide weapons to countries that violate internationally recognized human rights or block U.S. humanitarian aid. That is not my opinion. That is what the law says. Madam President, according to the United Nations, according to much of the international community, according to virtually every humanitarian organization on the ground in Gaza, Israel is clearly in violation of these laws. Under these circumstances, it is illegal for the United States government to provide Israel with more offensive weapons. These joint resolutions of disapproval are Congress's tool to enforce the law, and that is exactly what we must do. Madam President, it has been more than 13 months since the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack on Israel, an attack which killed 1,200 innocent people and took 250 hostages, including Americans. As I have said many, many times, Israel had the absolute right to respond to that horrific Hamas attack as any other country would. I don't think anybody here in the United States Senate disagrees with that. But Prime Minister Netanyahu's extremist government has not simply waged war against Hamas. It has waged an all-out war against the Palestinian people. Madam President, within Gaza's population of just 2.2 million people, and I want people to conceptualize that, that's about the size of New Mexico. 2.2 million people, more than 43,000 Palestinians have been killed, and more than 103,000 injured, a population of about the size of New Mexico. 60% of those who have been killed and injured are women, children, or elderly people. According to satellite imagery, 2/3 of all structures in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. 2/3 of all structures, think about that. 2/3 of all structures have been damaged or destroyed. That includes 87% of the housing, 84% of health facilities, 84% of health facilities, and 70% of sanitation plants. Right now, there is raw sewage running through the streets of Gaza, and it is very difficult for the people there to obtain clean drinking water. Madam President, every one of Gaza's 12 universities has been bombed. They got 12 universities. Every single one of them has been bombed, as have many hundreds of schools. For 13 months, there has been no electricity in Gaza. Madam President, during the last year, millions of desperately poor people in Gaza have been repeatedly driven from their homes and forced to evacuate time and time again with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. So let's imagine millions of people driven from their homes, told to go here, told to go there, and going from one place to another. Families in Gaza have been herded into so-called safe zones, only to face continued bombardment. They're told to go to this area, and the bombs start falling, and the children start dying. Madam President, the children of Gaza have suffered a level of physical and emotional abuse that is almost beyond comprehension. Abuse that will stay with them for the rest of their lives. These children, today, as we speak, right now, are hungry, they are thirsty, they cannot access health care, and all around them, they have witnessed death and destruction. That is what the children of Gaza have experienced, and Gaza is a very young population. And Madam President, as horrific as that situation is, what has happened over the last year, what is taking place today, right now, this moment, as we discuss this issue, it is even worse, if that is imaginable. As a result of Israel blocking desperately needed humanitarian aid, the volume of aid getting into Gaza in recent weeks is lower than at any point since the war began. More aid is needed, less aid is getting through. The result, many thousands of children are facing malnutrition and starvation. Let me repeat that. Many thousands of children today are facing malnutrition and starvation. This is not my observation. This is what the leaders of the 19 most important humanitarian organizations on the ground in Gaza, including the American head of UNICEF, Kathy Russell, and the American head of the World Food Program, Cindy McCain, wife of our former colleague John McCain. That is what they say. According to their recent report, quote, the situation unfolding in North Gaza is apocalyptic. Basic life-saving goods are not available. Humanitarians are not safe to do their work and are blocked by Israeli forces and by insecurity from reaching people in need, end of quote, and they continue. As a result, quote, the entire population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence, end of quote. These are the 19 major humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza right now, including several of the major ones led by Americans. And Israel's recent decision to ban UNRWA, the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, will only make a horrific situation even worse. Madam President, I have met with doctors who have served in Gaza, treating hundreds of patients a day without electricity, without anesthesia, without clean water, including dozens of children arriving with gunshot wounds in the head. I've seen the photographs and the videos, and we have some of them here. I've heard from UNICEF, who estimate that 10 children lose a leg in Gaza every single day. There are now more than 17,000 orphans in Gaza. Madam President, let me quote from a New York Times opinion piece of October 9th, 2024, a little more than a month ago, where American doctors and nurses in Gaza, these are Americans working in Gaza, describe what they saw on the ground. Merrill Tidings is a nurse from New Mexico, and she said, quote, these people were starving. She's talking about healthcare workers, her colleagues. These people were starving. I learned very quickly to not drink in my water or eat the food I had brought in front of the healthcare workers because they had gone so many days without, end of quote, without food, without water. Dr. Nadal Farah from Ohio said, quote, malnutrition was widespread. It was common to see patients reminiscent of Nazi concentration camps with skeletal features, end of quote, Dr. Farah. Abira Mohammed, a nurse from Dallas, Texas, said, quote, everyone we met showed us pictures of themselves before October. They had all lost 20 to 60 pounds of weight. Most patients and staff looked emaciated and dehydrated, end of quote. Dr. Nareen Ahmad from Philadelphia said, quote, every patient I treated had evidence of malnutrition. For example, poor wound healing and rapidly developing infections. Dr. Aman Odeh from Texas said, quote, mothers on the maternity ward delivered prematurely Because of malnutrition, stress, and infection, milk production was poor due to lack of hydration and adequate food supply, end of quote. And Dr. Mike Millar from Charleston said, quote, all of my patients were suffering from malnutrition, 100%, end quote. Madam President, what is important to understand, and I'm not sure that many of my colleagues do, is that the Israel of today that we are dealing with is not the Israel of Golda Meir or Yitzhak Rabin. This is a government now controlled not only by right-wing extremists, but by religious zealots. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who oversees the police, has been convicted in Israeli courts on terrorism charges. He's the head of the police. Finance Minister Smotrich, in charge of the occupied West Bank, is also an extreme racist and has called for the expulsion of Palestinians from the land. That is the current Israeli finance minister. Madam President, in January, Prime Minister Netanyahu said of Gaza, and I quote, "We provide minimal humanitarian aid if we want to achieve our war goals," end of quote. At the start of the war, the Israeli defense minister said, and I quote, and I hope people hear this, Israeli defense minister, ex-minister, quote, "We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed," end quote, former Israeli defense minister. That is what he said, and in fact, by and large, that is exactly how this war has been waged. Madam President, what this extremist government has done in Gaza is unspeakable. But what makes it even more painful is that much of this has been done with U.S. weapons and American taxpayer dollars. In the last year alone, the U.S. has provided $18 billion in military aid to Israel. $18 billion. And by the way, a few blocks from here, people are sleeping out on the street. And we have also delivered more than 50,000 tons of military equipment to Israel, 50,000 tons. In other words, Madam President, the United States of America is complicit in all of these atrocities. We are funding these atrocities. That complicity must end, and that is what these resolutions are about. It is time to tell the Netanyahu government that they cannot use U.S. taxpayer dollars and American weapons in violation of U.S. and international law and our moral values. Despite receiving $18 billion from U.S. taxpayers in the last year and being the largest historical recipient of U.S. foreign aid, the Netanyahu government has completely ignored the repeated requests of President Biden and the U.S. government. It is time to make clear to Netanyahu that he cannot take American money, take American arms, and continue to undermine U.S. foreign policy goals. The U.S. government wants a ceasefire for hostage deal. Netanyahu has prevented a deal to preserve his coalition. The U.S. government wants more humanitarian aid to reach the desperate people in Gaza. Netanyahu is blocking that aid. The U.S. government wants to contain regional escalation. Netanyahu has refused diplomatic off-ramps and launched several reckless attacks without consulting the United States. The United States government wants to stop settlement expansion and settler violence in the West Bank. Netanyahu and his ministers have driven record settlement expansion and armed extremist settlers. The U.S. government wants a plan for post-war governance in Gaza yet Netanyahu will not engage. And by the way, blocking these sales would also be in keeping with actions taken by some of our closest allies. The United Kingdom suspended 30 arms export licenses after concluding there was an unacceptable risk they could be used in violation of international law. Germany, Italy, Spain, Canada, Belgium, and the Netherlands have taken similar steps. UN bodies have called for an end to the arms shipments fueling the conflict. Madam President, time and time again, I've heard members of the U.S. Senate come to this floor to denounce human rights violations taking place around the world. I've heard well-founded concerns about China's brutal reception of the Uyghur ethnic minority. I've heard rightful outrage about Putin's brutal attacks against Ukraine and bombing of civilian installations. I've heard genuine concern about Iran's outrageous crackdown on peaceful protesters. I've heard repeated condemnations of Saudi Arabia's terrible treatment of women and political dissidents. And on it goes. A lot of folks come to the floor to talk about human rights and what's going on throughout the world. But what I want to say to all those folks, nobody is going to take anything you say with a grain of seriousness. You cannot condemn human rights around the world and then turn a blind eye to what the United States government is now funding in Israel. People will laugh in your face. They will say to you, you're concerned about China, you're concerned about Russia, you're concerned about Iran. Well, why are you funding the starvation of children in Gaza right now? So, Madam President, we must pass these resolutions from a legal perspective. The U.S. government must obey the law. We must pass these resolutions from a moral perspective. The United States must not provide support to a government which has created one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern history. We must pass these resolutions for our own best foreign policy interests. If we do not demand that the countries we provide military assistance to obey international law, we will lose our credibility on the world stage. And with that, Madam President, I would like to yield to Senator Merkley of Oregon.